This is my favorite section of complex numbers. I find this to be really fun just because we're going to see this pattern right now. So let's go through the pattern. We're going to introduce this pattern. The pattern you can see here actually, and we'll talk about this right now. And it's a pretty easy assignment once you see the pattern. So what's going on here? So we went over that I is the square root of negative 1. So what would I squared be? Well, that's I times I, which is the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1. And if you think about it, what's the square root of 3 times the square root of 3? Well, that's going to be the square root of 9, which is 3. What's the square root of 100 times the square root of 100? Well, that's going to be the square root of 10,000, which is 100. I want you to notice something here. When we multiply the square root of something times itself like that, you just end up, the square root cancels out. You can assume this pattern. Square root of pi times square root of pi. That's going to be square root of pi squared, which is just pi, because the square root and the squared cancel each other out. Square root of pizza times the square root of pizza. You can just assume this is going to equal pizza. So what's going to happen here? What's my point? What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 equals negative 1. Then I to the third is going to be I times I times I, which is really I squared times I. Well, we know I squared is negative 1. So that's going to be negative 1 times I. So it's just going to be negative I. Or negative square root of negative 1. Because we know that I is the square root of negative 1, depending upon how they want to see the answer. We could see here that they're keeping it as I to the third is negative I, which is fine. Oops, I think they need to fix that. I to the 1 is just I. Let me fix that right now. Okay, then I to the fourth, this is the last one before we see things repeating. That would be I squared times I squared. Well, what is I squared? If you remember, I squared is negative 1. So it's negative 1 times negative 1, which is 1. So these are the key three. These are the main four. We'll call that main four. Let's look at what happens after that. I to the fifth would be I to the 1 times I to the fourth. Well, I to the fourth is just 1, right? So that's going to equal I to the sixth is going to be I squared times I to the fourth. Remember, I to the fourth is 1, so it's really I squared times 1, which is I squared. And what is I squared? Negative 1. I to the seventh is I to the third times I to the fourth. And what's I to the fourth? Well, I to the fourth is just 1. Oops, made a mistake there. So we're just left with I to the third. And what's I to the third? It's negative I. And then I to the eighth is I to the fourth times I to the fourth, which is 1 times 1, which is 1. So you can see this pattern just continued. It just went I, negative 1, negative I, and 1, just like we had here. I, negative 1, negative I, and 1. So we see this is just going to keep continuing. I to the ninth will just be I again. I to the 10th will be negative 1. I to the 11th will be negative I. I to the 12th is I again. So how do we figure this out each time? So if we go through these as examples, here's what we're going to do. We're going to divide 41. So our exponent is 41. So we're going to take 41 and write it nicely first. So 41 divided by 4. We're going to divide it by 4. So that goes in 1, and then minus is 0. Bring down the 1. So 1 with a remainder of 1. So the key thing here is the remainder. So the remainder is what we're going to go with. So since the remainder is 1, let me just write this down. So you basically divide by 4. And if your remainder is 1, you put I. If your remainder is 2, you put negative 1. If your remainder is 3, then you put negative I. If your remainder is 4, then you put 1. So let's just put that into a table. So there you go. So first, divide by 4, then whatever your remainder is, that's going to be your answer. So let's just go ahead and do that same thing here. So we have I to the 54. So 54 divided by 4 goes in 1 time, leaves us with 1. Bring down the 4, goes in 3 times, minus is 2. So our remainder is 2. So our answer would be -1. So that one's -1, and then this one was I.